The 1980s was a decade littered with films which were meant to be blockbusters. Movies that studios hoped could become financial juggernauts in cinemas, as well as cultural ones beyond them. If they could also deliver a hit soundtrack or a sequel, or even better, both, then they could truly become new franchises for an industry thirsty for profits. Some movies managed to make the grade. A few even achieved every single objective, the money-spinning hand of aces that would become Hollywood's template for decades to come. A lot of the 80s blockbuster contenders, however, were left after their cinema runs with little more than box office disappointment and broken dreams. Some have since gone on to become much-loved classics, whilst others have, rightly or wrongly, remained largely forgotten. As is often true in life though, it is these perceived underachievers which tend to have the most interesting tales to tell. So today, come along for the ride as we explore some of these very films, investigate exactly what happened, and ask whether they deserve more upon release. Time will tell as to whether this series fares any better than the movies we'll be covering and makes a return to the channel.
I'll be back.
Yes, thank you, Skeletor. Anyway, whether this show makes it to another episode or not, let's live in the moment and dive headfirst into evaluating some of the most captivating examples of 80s movie moments that didn't quite pop off when they landed in cinemas. Thank you, and welcome to the show. Tonight we'll be covering 4 lost blockbusters from the glorious days of the 1980s, which didn't end up becoming the chart-smashing cinema hit their backers hoped they would be. And we're going to start with a truly iconic film of the era. If you like this sort of thing, then please do consider subscribing to Culture Slice. But for now, let's rewind to 1986 and a truly unique talent's attempt to turn his genius into a major summer smash hit movie. Wait, I can hear the rumblings now. Yes, Labyrinth, the fantasy classic Labyrinth, with David Bowie, that one. It's a bona fide icon of 80s cinema now, but there can be absolutely no question that, at the time of its release, it was far from a blockbuster. In fact, when it came out in North America in the summer of 1986, it was labelled as a flop. So let's analyse what actually happened. Labyrinth was, of course, directed by Jim Henson, the legendary Muppet and Sesame Street creator, a man whose company had taken the fairly maligned puppeteering art form to the top of the entertainment business. There had been a couple of Muppet films, with 1979's Muppet Movie, which was a big hit and was followed by Henson's own 1981 directorial debut, the less profitable Great Muppet Caper. But he had visions beyond the Muppets. He wanted to use puppetry and adjacent storytelling devices to make legitimate, serious movies. 1982's The Dark Crystal, which Henson co-directed with Frank Oz, was a watermark moment for his company and the techniques he had pioneered. This was a serious, layered, and yes, dark fantasy epic with very little comic relief, a total change of pace from his previous work. It remains a pretty staggering achievement. I mean, if you actually watch some of the scenes and consider the craft required to deliver them, it's mind-blowing. Though the box office started slow, it managed to make a profit on its $25 million budget from its US cinema run alone. As Frank Oz notes, it wasn't a huge hit, but it was successful, a one-of-a-kind piece of work that got back to Jim's experimental roots. Many critics at the time, however, saw it as flawed, appreciating its visuals and world building, but feeling it didn't quite have the story or characters to back them up. FYI, I love The Dark Crystal, but I wasn't reviewing movies in America in 1982. Anyway, after the Henson Company went back to the day job, with The Muppets Take Manhattan and a Sesame Street movie, Henson was ready to again attempt to tackle directing beyond that world by the mid-80s. He re-enlisted Brian Froud, the artist who Henson had collaborated with for The Dark Crystal, before asking Terry Jones to plot out the story, and the script was tweaked and updated by numerous people prior to filming beginning. Henson felt that a lack of human characters had hurt The Dark Crystal, so made sure that both the hero of the piece and its key villain were both real human beings. The fact that one of them also happened to be a legitimate music superstar wouldn't hurt with the songs either. The story revolved around Sarah, played by newcomer Jennifer Connelly, chosen from a huge pool of auditionees, a teenager who impulsively wishes for her baby brother Toby to be taken away by David Bowie's Goblin King. Realizing the error of her ways, Sarah must then enter the labyrinth to find Toby before the time elapses and he becomes a permanent goblin. Along the way, she meets a wild cast of characters, and there's the opportunity for David Bowie to perform a few banger songs in conjunction with the residents of this unique world. Labyrinth was filmed between April and September 1985, largely at Elstree Studios, although the preparations had predated this by more than a year. Henson and his team mixed more advanced puppetry with animatronics and the human stars, and the shoot was very complex. With huge sets created, it's a testament to Henson and his legion of puppeteers that such a unique film didn't take longer to complete, and that the budget came in at $25 million. With George Lucas as an actively involved executive producer, to the extent that he helped Henson with the final cut of the film. Expectations were high prior to release for ambitious upstart studio TriStar Pictures' biggest release of the summer. Adding a pair of David Bowie singles with music videos, video game and merchandise tie-ins, and a prominent peak season launch date, this felt like the moment. Could Jim Henson release a genuine summer blockbuster? Critical reaction to Labyrinth was not glowingly positive at the time, and occasionally bordered on abusive. Gene Siskel was particularly harsh, calling Labyrinth a really quite awful film with a pathetic story, which was an enormous waste of talent and money. His review concluded that Henson was completely at sea when he tries to create more mature entertainment. Basically, stick with the Muppets, mate. Not all critics were so brutal. The New York Times review called it a fabulous film. Roger Ebert also liked it more than Siskel, but noted that though great energy and creativity went into the construction, Labyrinth didn't have a story that does justice to the production. Good reviews were very much in the minority. Evaluations veered from saying that there was something missing to it being loaded with lavish details but not much else, and that it was an unpleasant trip. Labyrinth opened on June 27, 1986 in North America, and in its first week on release, it managed to make it to number 8 at the box office. I mean, there was some pretty strong competition up against it, but still, that was seen as a noticeable disappointment. The next week, it dropped out of the top 10 and would continue to fall down the chart until it left cinemas in August. Total North American takings for the film's first run were $12.7 million, considerably below what The Dark Crystal managed against its $25 million budget. Did it deserve better on its initial release? Definitely. It's one of the most unique and creative cinematic visions of the 1980s. Am I surprised it didn't achieve more success instantly? Well, no, not really. In hindsight, maybe Labyrinth not becoming an instant smash hit wasn't surprising at all. David Bowie was a star, but he wasn't an obvious blockbuster movie star, and Jennifer Connelly, in just her 4th film, was an unknown quantity. Fantasy films by this point had repeatedly underperformed at the box office as well. The movie had a lot going for it, but also wasn't easily definable in a single line. That meant that marketing the thing needed a nuance which didn't seem to be forthcoming. It was different, that was for sure, and its strengths could be seen as weaknesses in the unforgiving world of Hollywood's summer release slate. As a sign of the general direction of travel, a planned December release for a third single from the soundtrack was cancelled. As some Brian reflected recently, I do think Labyrinth was the one where he thought they just didn't like it. People don't like it, and he really didn't expect that. The reaction and box office affected Henson, a natural overthinker. He'd poured his heart and soul into the film and was genuinely excited to prove that he could deliver on the promise of The Dark Crystal and graduate as a filmmaker beyond the Muppets. In his mind, when Labyrinth was met with a muted response, he had failed. But the thing is, that wasn't the whole story. As it was rolled out in other territories over the rest of 1986 and into 1987, it was greeted more positively. It did really well in the UK, where it received a royal premiere with Charles and Diana, before becoming the biggest film of Christmas 1986, and repeated that in other countries along the way. In the end, the total worldwide takings of $34 million weren't close to blockbuster levels, but the film had found a receptive audience outside of the US. For a film like Labyrinth though, it always felt like its true legacy would be found beyond the first watch, and that absolutely proved to be the case. It has remained constantly on TV and became a huge success on first video and then DVD and Blu-ray. Lord knows how many copies it has sold, but I'd wager that half of my friends have at least one copy. It's now generally considered as a true classic, maintains a massive following, and is acknowledged as a legitimately valuable example of fantasy filmmaking. Labyrinth would be the last film Henson would direct, and he largely went back to making TV in the years that followed its release. Brilliant, imaginative, innovative TV, but TV nonetheless. He negotiated a deal to sell his company to Disney so he could concentrate on creativity rather than business, but that wouldn't be completed before his untimely death in 1990.
Jim Henson's sudden death has saddened Muppet fans everywhere, adults and children alike.
He never got another attempt at making a summer blockbuster, but he was able to bask in some of the glowing afterlife Labyrinth received from international markets and home viewing. He saw it go from a flop to a classic. And what a legacy he has left behind. As Henson said of the message of Labyrinth, you don't have to give up your fantasies because you grow up. They're part of you all your life. Welcome back. In life, timing is as important as talent, and getting your timing wrong can have a whole host of residual impacts as well. This is as true as ever for our next film, one which perhaps should have become the next big thing in the summer of 1984, but that, aside from anything else, had the bad fortune of arriving at the peak of one of the strongest years the movie business has ever produced.
Greetings, Starfighter.
1984, what a year for Hollywood that was. I mean, you had Ghostbusters and Gremlins released on the same day, and The Karate Kid following just 2 weeks later. Business was good, and creatively, things were pretty exciting. Entering this packed arena in July of '84 was a brand new player. You could call it the original Ready Player One. It didn't feature any major stars or an enormous budget, but it had a lot going for it if it could grab some attention amongst the busy cinematic field. The Last Starfighter was the brainchild of a young screenwriter named Jonathan Betuel, and was the first script of his which had been greenlit. Production house Lorimar was more known for its TV properties, which included the likes of Dallas and Knots Landing at the time, and had produced hit films like An Officer and a Gentleman, But it wasn't in the market for sci-fi epics. This was something of a jump into the unknown for them as well. But producer Gary Adelson, known for TV shows and TV movies, and his team saw the potential. Plus, their co-production agreement with Universal meant that the film had a distributor ready to go, and a $15 million budget was set in place to deliver it. Even with all this ready though, the film was ambitious. In the wake of the mind-blowing world created for 1982's Tron, The Last Starfighter was hoping to continue to push cinema's technical boundaries. As Adelson remembers, a guy named John Whitney, who was an MIT genius and a great salesman, sold me on the idea of doing something that had never been done before, which is photorealistic computer graphics. And somehow, I sold Lorimar and Universal on that it could be done. Even though it never had been done, we didn't know if it could be done, but we set out to do it anyway. Even if Tron had used vector-based graphics to create its ultra-stylized aesthetic 2 years prior, The Last Starfighter was still attempting to add fully rendered 3D environments and objects in a slightly more recognizable world and in a brand new way, replacing the standard process for model-based effects work. Working within the technical CGI restraints of the day, it was massively innovative. The director chosen for the project was Michael Myers. Yes, Michael Myers, or at least the guy who played him in the original Halloween movie, Nick Castle. Castle had written Escape from New York with John Carpenter and had only directed one film before this, the mad 1982 slasher satire comedy action based around the game popular at unis at the time, Tag, the assassination game. It had cost $3 million to make, doesn't seem to have made much or been released on video or DVD, but it is available in full on YouTube and appears to have found an audience in Germany.
Du darfst mir nicht verraten.
Even the star of The Last Starfighter, Lance Guest, had only been in 2 films before, so the project was filled with fresh faces on both sides of the camera. On-set filming began in October 1983 and was wrapped in December, but the film's extensive use of CGI meant that there was still months of computer work ahead before it could be released. The movie told the story of Alex, whose world revolved around a dusty trailer park community. His life is unremarkable, apart from the fact that he is really, really good at playing the Starfighter arcade game outside the local store. When he breaks the record score, he discovers that this is in fact a test simulator, and that he has now been recruited by a man called Centauri, played by Robert Preston, to become an elite starfighter. Eventually, he becomes the galaxy's lone chance of success for the Star League in a legitimate intergalactic war against the Kodan Armada. There's also a subplot with an android version of Alex placed on Earth so that his girlfriend, Catherine Mary Stewart's Maggie, and his family don't clock that he's gone, and some buddy comedy hijinks between Alex and his new best friend, alien pilot Grig, played by Dan O'Herlihy. When the film was ready for preview screenings, critical response was generally positive, if not overly gushing in praise, but they liked it. Reviews range from corny but somehow it works, to clever, exciting and fun, and good-humoured, bent on action and even touching.
When all these complications have been sorted out, The Last Starfighter girds up its loins to become a fairly straightforward space adventure, and a very enjoyable one it is. The electronic effects and gadgetry are, as we've now come not only to expect but to demand, very impressive indeed, and the human story is nicely handled too. One might quibble that the film cribs rather heavily from Star Wars and Close Encounters, but if you have to pinch ideas, these are good places to pinch them from.
The Last Starfighter was released in North American cinemas on July 13th, 1984, and became a contender, at least initially, landing in 3rd place in its opening weekend, behind Ghostbusters and Gremlins, and ahead of The Karate Kid, although that had been out for 4 weeks already at this point. Unlike all 3 of those films though, it didn't offer that much staying power. The Last Starfighter dropped out of the top 10 in its 3rd week and was out of cinemas before the end of August. Total North American box office exceeded $22 million, which extended to more than $29 million from international takings as the film was released across the world over the coming months. Sadly, this was nothing compared to the behemoths which dominated cinema in the summer of '84. and it left a real sense of what might have been. Far from a blockbuster, The Last Starfighter became, from a purely business perspective, just another movie. So why didn't The Last Starfighter succeed in becoming a breakout blockbuster? Obviously, there's the competition. 84 has to go down as a top 5 year for Hollywood of the last 40 years, perhaps ever. Avoiding the summer release date in this instance might have given it more of a shot. It was never going to compare with the marketing power behind more prominent releases, so launching outside of peak season was, in all likelihood, the way to go. The CGI was innovative, but certainly different for audiences brought up on the model-based work of the Star Wars movies. The film may well have been a victim of its own early adopter status. The movie tries to be a lot of things, from romantic comedy to screwball farce to coming-of-age drama to sci-fi epic. It manages to hit them on the target pretty well, with a clever twist on the sci-fi genre thrown in, but it did make the promotion for the film a bit more complex. Equally, between the time the movie was greenlit and made, the entire video game industry in the United States saw a massive recession, crashing the second wave of gaming in North America and not recovering until 1985, long after The Last Starfighter had left cinemas. It feels like launching a movie with a narrative driven by a video game in the middle of this period would probably impact the trajectory of said movie. Once again, bad timing had struck. But despite all of this, it has remained a favourite of mine over the decades. It's a pretty lo-fi film for an intergalactic sci-fi space opera, something which might have contributed to it not setting the world alight in cinemas, but that also helps to make it unique. The production design is beautiful, Craig Safan's score is genuinely outstanding, and the performances are universally excellent. I get the Star Wars light critique and the analysis that it's cheesy, and that's all part of its charm. It won't change the world, and the effects have dated of course, but it's so well made, and with its heart in the right place, it never fails to draw me in whenever it turns up again in my life, like an alien recruiter in a trailer park. And The Last Starfighter's heritage has lived on. The film found a larger audience on VHS as rentals and then sales became a bigger and bigger opportunity for Hollywood redemption. Cable TV became a natural home for a movie which has absolutely had a considerable extended shelf life. And it is one which I think is richly deserved. Alex's escape from his day-to-day reality becomes the ticket to changing his life forever. Though it's unlikely any of us will be recruited for interstellar battles anytime soon, there's a lesson about following our dreams that I think we would all be well placed to be reminded of from time to time. Welcome back to the show. Thank you. Can somebody have them removed, please? Hello? Hello? Anyway, moving forward a year to 1985, we arrive at a movie which attempted to tell a deceptively complex tale of how warring parties have more in common than they do in conflict, but ended up with a fired director, a massively delayed production which ballooned way over budget, and a messy release that fell apart at the box office. But did this mid-80s sci-fi movie actually deserve considerably better? I've always been fascinated by films which arrive after really messy, difficult productions. Sometimes you can clearly see the growing pains on camera, in the performances or the technical issues. And sometimes they're received so badly that they can even bring down entire studios. In the case of the seemingly never-ending creation of a movie like 1985's Enemy Mine, however, the issues the film had ended up damning the whole project before it was even in cinemas. Enemy Mine was adapted from a 1979 short story of the same name, created by Barry Longyear, which appeared in Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine in 1979. The title was a reference to the feelings of the two protagonists, as in Enemy of Mine, although the studio later requested that an actual mine was added to the movie so as not to confuse the audience too much. Hollywood, eh? It was greenlit to go into production in 1983, more than 2 years before the finished product would eventually be delivered, initially under the direction of Richard Loncraine, a BBC trainee who had made British films, TV and adverts before being called up to Hollywood. Enemy Mine told the story of a pair of soldiers, one human and one alien, on opposite sides of a late 21st century space-age war, who are both stranded on a wasteland of a planet far from their homes. Despite being enemies, they learn that they must work together to survive, in turn opening the possibility of reconsidering their deep-seated hatred for each other and their races. As the tagline explained it upon release, enemies because they were taught to be, allies because they had to be, brothers because they dared to be. 20th Century Fox saw sense in the commission of the film, after their own Lucasfilm-produced Star Wars releases had made the race to find the next sci-fi hits a priority of the whole industry. A lot of the films that had entered that race had also been box office bombs, but that's par for the course in Hollywood to some extent, and Enemy Mine would, theoretically, be fairly straightforward to make, given that the main body of the film took place in the stable setting of the inhospitable planet. Best laid plans, I guess. It was clear that the film would live or die on the casting of the two main characters. For the human lead Davidge, Loncraine installed up-and-coming star Dennis Quaid, who had broken out in 1983's Oscar-nominated The Right Stuff and had just become the lead of Dreamscape, another sci-fi movie. For Jerry, the alien from the Drac species, Lou Gossett Jr. took the role. Becoming a Drac required Gossett Jr. to spend 5 hours or more every day in the makeup room, but he was up for it, after winning the Best Supporting Actor Oscar in 1982 for An Officer and a Gentleman. He had, in his own words, struggled to build on that success with the kind of roles he craved. I thought I'd be able to write my own ticket. I was very disappointed, but now I feel I'm getting somewhere. Getting somewhere, however, is more than could be said for Enemy Mine. On-location shooting began in April 1984 in Iceland, a move executive producer Stanley O'Toole fought against. The studio backed their Iceland-loving director, but this rapidly proved a flawed decision. As makeup and effects artist Chris Wallace remembers, working in Iceland was an amazingly grueling experience. It was simply astonishing how badly the production went. Not only was the shoot chaotic, but the footage they were seeing was apparently far from what the execs envisaged. Eventually, at the behest of executive producer O'Toole, Fox agreed to fire Loncraine and shut down production. With millions already spent on the movie, Enemy Mine's future was completely uncertain. They obviously needed a new director, and fairly sharpish. The studio wanted Wolfgang Petersen, an Oscar nominee for 1981's Das Boot, and a man who was on the verge of releasing The Never-Ending Story. I got a call in the middle of the night. It was my agent calling. He said he had just got a call from Iceland, asking if I would like to take over a very big, very important film called Enemy Mine. I said no. 48 hours later though, Petersen changed his mind, but only if he could fully complete things on The Never-Ending Story and, after he had seen the Enemy Mine footage so far, if he could also scrap the lot and start again from scratch. Petersen wanted to move production to Bavaria Studios in Munich, with some on-location shooting in Lanzarote, and pause work for 6 months to allow him and his team to prepare. Obviously, this would add a considerable amount to the budget and move the movie from a summer to a winter release, but it could salvage what was an important film from Fox's 1985 slate. For Quaid and Gossett Jr., they would be kept on the payroll throughout. A pretty sweet deal, and as the latter put it at the time, neither of us was complaining. The entire visual design of the movie was overhauled, right down to a total change of Gossett Jr.'s alien look, and what was now Peterson's film moved into production in the winter of 1984. With the crossover of different ideas and various teams from Germany and the States, along with regular technical issues causing further delays. Unsurprisingly, the overall budget had increased, and the onus on the film to become a big hit had ballooned with it. In the end, Enemy Mine cost more than $40 million, and rumours persist that it was even higher, more than double the original estimate and far more than many of the most successful movies of 1985's summer season, such as Back to the Future, The Goonies and Cocoon. By the time the film was ready for release, summer and autumn of '85 were in the rearview mirror. Having already pushed so much cash into the furnace on the movie, Fox decided to go all out with a massive marketing spend to top it off. They bought full-page adverts in the major newspapers, ran TV commercial roadblocks on the big networks, and plastered the malls of America with posters. After all this, could this basket case of a production actually deliver a winter blockbuster movie? Initial critical responses, though not all negative, didn't exactly bode very well for that to become a reality. Janet Maslin in the New York Times said it was a costly, awful-looking science fiction epic with one of the weirdest storylines ever to hit the screen, and it was labelled as one of the largest wastes of money ever in TV Guide. Even the more positive reviews didn't indicate that this movie, which needed to make big money, would be successful, as Gene Siskel noted. Although you probably haven't heard much about Enemy Mine this season, you might want to check it out. You'll be pleasantly surprised. Welcome to this very special Christmas edition of Film 1985. Even though the likes of Back to the Future and Rambo First Blood Part 2 have proved big hits, the overall story of the year has been the glut of financial failures, including the likes of Return to Oz and The Black Cauldron. Never fear though, winter is here, and it brings with it box office banker Rocky IV, along with Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple, and maybe the oddest major release we'll see this year. Enemy Mine features an alien speaking Russian backwards and impregnating themselves, and comes to you from the director of The Neverending Story. Obviously. But could this unique movie actually become the sleeper hit of 1985 at the very last minute? Sorry, flipped into 80s presenter mode again for a second there. Anyway, the film finally arrived in cinemas on December 20th, 1985, and stumbled to number 9 in its first weekend, making just over $1.5 million. Total box office of little over $12 million marked Enemy Mine as a complete and utter flop. Reports at the time indicated it would have needed to make $100 million to break even. It never stood a chance. In the end, Enemy Mine has to be seen as a cursed production, almost from the beginning, but watching it back 40 years later, the movie is shockingly good despite it all. I struggle to understand some of the harsher reviews from the time. Quaid and Gossett Jr. are terrific in the lead roles, and the calm, methodical, thoughtful pace allows for engrossing character development. It feels old school, more like a theatre play than an 80s sci-fi movie, and that's a really good thing. Things do get a little messier as we head towards the final act, but the main body of the movie is really solid. I'm totally perplexed as to why they thought this would work as a tentpole summer movie, even before all the production issues, but it holds a lot more to cherish than its checkered history behind the scenes would indicate. After such a huge spend on making the movie and then marketing it, box office performance would have needed to be outstanding, and that was always highly unlikely. The adverts and posters made it look like some sort of Clash of the Titans sci-fi shoot 'em up, whereas the real movie feels like something much more subdued and considered. If it had remained with a lower budget and not over-promoted as a blockbuster in waiting, Enemy Mine maybe could have had a chance. A slow build push towards a far lower bar of profitability. I guess at the time that wasn't really the done thing with sci-fi movies, and as the chips fell in the real world, it was DOA when it did land in cinemas. The movie has since built up a small screen fan base and deserves its status as a cult classic. It took Peterson 6 years to make another film in Hollywood, 1991 Shattered, and it wasn't until In the Line of Fire 2 years later that his US career would really catch a blaze. Lon Crane steered clear of Hollywood himself for a long time after his mid-80s troubles, and as far as I can tell, has never discussed his time on the project publicly. Enemy Mine ended up being a classic example of Hollywood chasing its own tail. The process of its creation left a lot of scars on some of those involved, but without all the madness, the film wouldn't exist as it does. And it's a film which has a lot of merit. Its failure at the box office, though, does go to show that not every movie is meant to be a blockbuster. For our final film tonight, we are going forward a couple of years to 1987, and a time when a rogue, over-leveraged and almost bankrupt film studio had promised to release the Star Wars of the 80s from a toy line and cartoon whose peak in popularity had been and gone. Starring Ivan Drago from Rocky IV. What could possibly go wrong? Or should that actually be right? Looking at it objectively, this movie should have been massive really, shouldn't it? If only basically everything had happened differently. Hollywood has an patchy history when it comes to adapting toy lines into movies, something which will be a part of its future as well. I mean, just because Barbie was such a triumph, it doesn't mean that the Rock'em Sock'em Robots or Hot Wheels movies are going to work out great too. Although a Viewmaster feature film might be pretty cool. Anyway, to give some grace to Hollywood, maybe this kind of adaptation running into trouble is partially understandable. It's obviously driven by a commercial imperative, and it's often recognizable IP without a fully fleshed out narrative or the required nuance to build a feature-length film around. Without license for creative freedom for the filmmakers, they could essentially become 90-minute adverts, and some padding is going to be required anyway. But even when you have that, things can still get messy, especially at a time when this kind of diversification into major movies was not a well-trodden path. After release in the early 1980s, Mattel's He-Man and the Masters of the Universe toys were some of the biggest selling on the planet. Ronald Reagan's administration had relaxed laws relating to advertising to kids, allowing for a glut of cartoons linked to toy brands to be thrust onto TV. And He-Man's cartoon became one of the most popular when it arrived on screens in 1983. An animated film starring not just He-Man but new cast addition She-Ra arrived 2 years later in cinemas. The thing is though, Hollywood wasn't interested in a live-action version, as exec producer Edward R. Pressman discovered when he started shopping the thing around town. A studio which would put the thing into production though was Cannon, and they had enough problems of their own at the time. Cannon was a unique studio. They were not one of the majors, but they did have some major success. Not least the Sylvester Stallone movie Cobra, which made $160 million, the equivalent of more than $450 million if adjusted for inflation today. Their bread and butter was B-movies and the kind of things the big studios wouldn't touch, and, for a time, their model worked, but their empire was built on sand. As they expanded into buying cinemas, distributors, and film libraries, that business model built on bad loans was now creating massive financial issues. All of this was happening as Masters of the Universe was being made and released, and impacted every stage of development. There were other red flags for the film. A year before Dolph & Co. hit the big screen, another major 80s toy and cartoon cash cow had made it into cinemas, in the form of 1986's Transformers the movie. Though I think this film was massively undervalued at the time and would love to make a full video about it one day, there's no doubt that this was not a success upon release, either critically or commercially. It should have been, but I'm keenly aware that being aggrieved about the unfair treatment received by an animated movie released almost 40 years ago might actually be the first sign of madness. I mentioned the original Transformers film not just because it is awesome, but also because it demonstrated further the negative air around toy lines in Hollywood as Masters of the Universe began to position itself on the starting line. There was already an increasingly dismissive tone in the reporting for animated adaptations, so a live-action He-Man was starting from a few steps further behind. In fact, filming on Masters of the Universe began just 3 days after Transformers the movie had landed in North American cinemas. Combine this with the fact that interest in the He-Man toys was beginning to wane fairly rapidly, and you had a cocktail of catastrophe ready to go. Mattel was banking on the movie to make the next year's toy line a success. The art of cinema, eh? Masters of the Universe was directed by Gary Goddard, who had industry experience and had created theme park rides aplenty, but had not directed a film before. For the all-important role of He-Man, the choice was Dolph Lundgren, the inexperienced martial artist turned actor who was just coming off his breakout role as Ivan Drago in Rocky IV. This was only his third movie, and he looked the part, but there was a concern if he could pull it off. The other key character was, of course, He-Man's nemesis Skeletor, and he was played by Frank Langella, a decorated stage and screen actor who took the part as his son was such a huge fan of the cartoons and toys. His performance is legitimately outstanding, and he chews the scenery apart in every scene he's in.
People of Eternia, I stand before the great eye of the galaxy, chosen by destiny to receive the powers of Grayskull.
The characters who did make it into the film were filled out by experienced thespians and inexperienced newcomers. Plenty of cartoon regulars weren't in the movie, and they even added a few new ones, such as Billy Barty's Gwildor, a locksmith and inventor who plays a fairly major part in the narrative here. A young Courtney Cox, fresh from TV work and a Bruce Springsteen music video, took on the part of Julie, who, along with her boyfriend Kevin, played by Robert Duncan McNeil, becomes the main ally of He-Man and crew on Earth, along with Back to the Future's James Tolkan as the interfering detective Lubin. Ah yes, Earth. The original script had been set largely on Eternia and was markedly different to what made it to cinemas, but the movie that did get made told the tale of He-Man and his allies being forced to escape to Earth to stop Skeletor from taking control of the Cosmic Key and therefore control of the universe. You see, Skeletor has taken over Castle Grayskull, the centre of power for the universe, and captured the good sorceress of Grayskull, played by Christina Pickles, who would also go on to become Courtney Cox's mum in Friends less than a decade later. On Earth, He-Man meets Julie and Kevin, and also making the trip are Skeletor's henchmen, and later is number 2 Evil Lyn and even the Evil Man himself. The battle for control of Eternia takes a road trip to California and back. The production of the film was far from smooth. Mattel had some say over the movie and initially vetoed things like He-Man hurting people, which was quite an ask. So the solution was generic bargain bin stormtroopers were added so that He-Man could obliterate them freely, a move which did not help with the Star Wars comparisons brought on by claims from canon that this would be the movie to replace it. Mattel were also shocked by the early footage they saw of Lundgren's accent, given he was from Sweden, and requested that his role be voiced by someone else. Eventually this went away after pushback from Canon, as did a lot of Mattel's micromanagement, when sales of their toy line spiraled downwards whilst the movie was being made, and the company demanded a hit film. Mattel and Canon had agreed to pay half of the film's budget each, but Canon were not so forthcoming with their half, so the film stumbled to the finish line. Crew pay didn't arrive on multiple occasions, but a staff mutiny was somehow avoided. As Goddard tells it, he put up his money and brought a skeleton crew to film the final battle between He-Man and Skeletor, using dark light to obscure the fact that the budget was gone. As Goddard remembers, the movie had a lot riding on it. The fact that most people don't know is that when we started this picture, we had two very desperate entities, Canon and Mattel, hoping that this picture was going to solve all of their problems. For Mattel, they were desperate for the film to reignite their ailing toy brand. For Canon, this was absolutely a last roll of the dice. Masters of the Universe was released on August 7th, 1987 in North America. It landed in 3rd spot in its opening weekend, behind The Living Daylights and Stakeout, but it built absolutely zero momentum. After one more week, it bowed out of the top 10, and after 2 more, it was out of cinemas. The Star Wars of the 80s made less money at the box office than Ernest Goes to Camp and Revenge of the Nerds 2, Nerds in Paradise. Reviews were, shall we say, suboptimal? Variety noted that all elements are of epic proportions in this Conan Star Wars hybrid ripoff, and the result is a colossal bore. While the LA Times called it a misfiring, underdone epic, the BBC's erstwhile reviewer Barry Norman wasn't particularly impressed either.
But lest I give the impression that Masters of the Universe could confidently plead not guilty to any possible charge of originality, I must add that He-Man and company do have a salutation I'd not heard before. Good journey, they say to each other on parting. And this, I imagine, is the intergalactic equivalent of have a nice day. What? The acting? Well, what kind of acting would you expect in stuff like this? Let us simply say that they all do their best in difficult circumstances.
Masters of the Universe grossed $17 million against a production budget of $22 million. Far from becoming a blockbuster, the movie was labelled a bomb at the time and is remembered as a disaster. I take all of this on board, and maybe it's partly thanks to my misty-eyed memories of watching this movie as a kid on BBC Two, but I can't help but feel a sense of love for this much maligned epic, despite all its flaws. The art direction veers from fairly non-existent to legitimately stunning. Everyone involved seems to be having a great time, whether in reality they were or not, and the 80s aesthetic pretty much oozes off the screen. Dolph Lundgren manages to get by as He-Man.
Let her go. I don't think so.
But this is Frank Langella's film really, giving one of the best villain performances in the history of sci-fi / action / comic book / toy adaptations / whatever you categorize this broad genre as. I really do think he should have been considered for award season, as crazy as that might sound, in a movie this derided. It's no surprise to hear that Skeletor is one of his favourite roles. Masters of the Universe, of course, never did become the Star Wars of the 80s and was always going to struggle to become a blockbuster under the circumstances. But it's a movie that I think has grown in stature with age. It's not a masterpiece or anything, but it is a time capsule film for a time we will never be going back to, as much as we or I might want to. Perhaps things could have been different. If they had managed to get a live action film released not too long after The Secret of the Sword animated film in the summer of 1985, or even replace that in the release schedule, the momentum might have been able to help carry a He-Man movie to more success. Or maybe not. I guess we'll never know. Canon intended to make a sequel without Lundgren and at a far lower budget, but that obviously didn't end up happening. After they balked at paying licensing fees to Mattel, the sets and costumes produced for the sequel would instead be used in the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie Cyborg. In the end, Cannon continued making films into the 90s, but collapsed in a sea of mergers and lawsuits, leaving the film industry poorer for losing one of the last renegade studios around. Mattel survived their sales dip, of course, and have mobilized their film output in recent years. The Mattel Films division has structure and plans and a roadmap of movies. Lots of toy movies. So the haphazard fumbling which characterized much of the production of the original Masters of the Universe film won't be happening again in the painfully organized world of modern media giants. Although how many big budget adaptations of toy brands the world really needs is another question, but that's a matter for another day. This ultra corporatization might lead to less mess, but it still feels like it is also losing a lot of the charm of films like Masters of the Universe. We may never see its like again, and for me, that actually is a shame. In Hollywood, the final chapter is rarely written for good. A remake or sequel for all 4 films that we've covered tonight has been at different stages of progress over the years. Some might even make it to cinemas in our lifetime. When Labyrinth became such a massive seller on DVD, Curse of the Goblin King was apparently floated seriously as a title for Part 2, and a reboot was officially announced in 2016. Apparently that is still the case in 2024, though it seems little progress has been made. Maybe that's for the best. A sequel to The Last Starfighter has been a talking point amongst fans for decades. The ending of Part 1 couldn't have set it up better. Due to legal issues over who actually owns the rights, it's looking increasingly unlikely that what would surely need to be a remake at this stage will happen anytime soon. But you never know. Earlier this year, it was confirmed that Star Trek Picard showrunner Terry Matalas was working on a remake of Enemy Mine. And a new Masters of the Universe film is actually locked in for the summer of 2026, and it's being directed by Travis Knight, who made the 2018 Bumblebee movie, so that does have some legitimate potential. Whether these movies actually need reboots is a matter of conjecture. I personally like new ideas. It feels like there being so many first time ever films was an important element of what made 80s cinema so magic. Even if studios were keen for sequels back then too. I guess Transformers films have made untold billions now, and He-Man has a story which hasn't been overexposed on the big screen, but if the new movie is a success, it certainly will be. Either way, in today's world, where Hollywood's hand is constantly in the old movie cookie jar, a good story idea is never laid to rest. As for Culture Slice's lost blockbusters, will we ever see that make a return? Or will it end as a forgotten relic of time gone by, cast aside in the YouTube Hall of Shame? And, after being so grateful for all the support so far, will the channel break the glass ceiling as we head on the road to 2,000 subscribers? Only time will tell on that front too.
Now available on video cassette.